Hello and welcome to Litquake. This is San Francisco's literary festival, and this evening's event is The Other America, Finding Common Ground with Kristof, Sheryl Wudunn, and Arlie Russell Hochschild. I am Jane Ganal. I'm the co-founder of Litquake, and in this 21st year of our festival, we are all virtual all the time, streaming from the Bay Area and other parts around the world through October 24th, which is actually Saturday. We only have a few days left of the festival and lots of amazing events, so please tune in to our website, litquake.org, to find out the rest of the schedule. We would like to think that given the stresses, shall we say, of 2020, that Litquake's mission of bringing connection, humanity, and inspiration to our audiences is more important than ever. That's one reason for tonight's event. And if you're so inclined, we'd welcome your donation to keep our festival bringing stories and storytelling to light. We would appreciate a donation at either Venmo, PayPal, or at litquake.org. We also want to thank everyone in the literary community who has helped put this festival together. It's always a group effort between our literary partners, of which there are dozens and dozens, to our board and our staff. Thank you all so much. Before I introduce our authors, a few orders of business. If you think of a question you'd like to ask during the session, please see the little Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. It will enable you to write a question. And toward the end of the hour, I will come back on and moderate those questions. After the event, you'll be able to fill out a short survey about how you felt about the event and who you are. Please do fill this out if you have a minute. It helps us in our future fundraising efforts. And don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and all that. You can also buy the latest books by our authors tonight by either going to your favorite independent bookstore or find the Litquake bookshelf at bookshop.org, which is our bookseller this year. And now, on with the show. Arlie Russell Hochschild of Berkeley fame, basically an icon of the Bay Area, is one of the most influential sociologists of her generation. She's the author of 9 books, including The Second Shift, The Time Bind, and most recently, Strangers in Their Own Land, which was a 2016 National Book Award finalist for nonfiction, a 2016 New York Times notable book, and a New York Times bestseller. It was also named, for better or for worse, I think, one of the 6 books to understand Trump's win after the 2016 election. I shouldn't say worse, that's only better. We all need to understand. To write the book, Arlie spent 5 years in the American South, learning as much as she could about the lives of conservative working class people. The Economist called it an entry pass to an alternative worldview, and with it, a route map toward empathy. That will be, I think, one of our themes tonight. Now, Kristof and Sheryl Wudunn have co-authored several books together, including A Path Appears and Half the Sky, which was, of course, a huge book bestseller. Together, they were awarded a Pulitzer Prize in 1990 for their coverage of China as journalists. Now an op-ed columnist for the New York Times, Kristof was previously bureau chief in Hong Kong, Beijing, and Tokyo. He won his second Pulitzer Prize in 2006 for his columns on Darfur. Wudunn is the first Asian American reporter to win a Pulitzer Prize, and she worked at the Times as a business editor and foreign correspondent in Tokyo and Beijing, and is now working in banking. Their latest bestseller is Tightrope, Americans Reaching for Hope, and it draws us deep into the, quote, other America, examining the crisis in working class America. NPR called it an agonizing account of how apathy and cruelty have turned America into a nightmare for many of its less fortunate citizens. At the same time, Dave Eggers notes that despite all the tragedy and neglect, Kristof and WuDunn conjure a picture of how it could all get better and how it could all work. That is the miracle of Tightrope and why this is such an indispensable book. Please welcome Nicholas Kristof, Sheryl Wudunn, and Arlie Hochschild. And turn on your volume, Arlie.
Yeah,
there you go.
Sorry about that. Well, I'd like to begin by saying I just find this an extraordinary book, and searing, and really takes you into people's lives, but at the same time, it's interpretive and helps us understand things. But I just wanted to start with the arresting beginning of the book, where the authors write that a quarter of the kids that Nick went to school with on the number 6 school bus in the 1970s in Yamhill, Oregon, are dead. And I just want to begin with just a paragraph I just found so arresting. They write, these kids seemed perfectly normal. They were wonderful. They were Nick's friends. Yet these kids ended up riding into a cataclysm as working class communities disintegrated across America, felled by lost jobs, broken families, and despair. How did they die? Well, it said about a quarter of the kids who rode with Nick on the school bus are dead from drugs, suicide, alcohol, obesity, reckless accidents, and other pathologies. A boy named Mike is dead from suicide after struggles with drugs. Steve from an aftermath of a foolhardy motorcycle accident. Cindy from depression, obesity, and then a heart attack. Jeff from a daredevil car crash, and so it goes on. So I guess I'd like to ask these gifted writers, what this is a face of pain, but it isn't starvation we're looking at, like Darfur. It's not migration. It's not the pain of leaving your home. It's almost the pain of staying in your home. So how would you characterize this crisis that you're giving us to think about?
So, Arlie, I mean, I think in many ways, it's very similar to what you wrote about 3,000 miles away. And it was kind of a crisis of identity and self-esteem and social isolation for a lot of my old friends. And I think particularly for the boys, later men, they'd grown up with the expectation that they were going to be the head of the household and have a good union job, earn a good living, be respected in the community the way their dads had. And that just didn't happen. They ended up bouncing around from job to job. The unions were collapsing. They ended up, in many cases, never earning an income that really enabled them to marry. So they never formed a stable household. And the social fabric at the time was disintegrating as well. So they were never really embedded in the community the way their parents' generation had. And they were lonely. And they self-medicated then with meth, which was just arriving and ravaging the area as well, followed by opioids.
So if I were a foreign correspondent from another country coming into Yamhill and other communities like Yamhill, I would say this is a humanitarian crisis, that this is a highly impoverished, dysfunctional area, which we have seen in other developing countries, where there's just enormous amount of poverty, not just in income, but also in education, in social community, in enlightenment. It's total poverty. And I think that's what we're seeing in a lot of these rural areas, in rural and urban areas, but rural areas in the US that really haven't been as much written about as the urban poverty has.
Right. But the two of you have given two different sides of the thing, it seems. I mean, one is a story of loss, not just poverty, but something you used to have something and it's gone now, which is one kind of pain. And the other is I don't have money, to pay the rent, or minimum wage job won't do it. What's the relative weight of those two facts, both of which are there?
I mean, one of the things that I came to appreciate in as we reported and wrote Tightrope was the importance of jobs, not just as a source of income, but as a source of identity, of self-esteem, of purpose, of meaning. And I think that, I think like a lot of Americans, I had thought jobs are important because of the income stream. And, that when somebody loses their job, well, we replace it with an income stream from unemployment compensation. And boy, that just does not work. And that may be particularly true of some of these men who Michelle Lamont has written about this, and the way that job is just so important as your status in the community. And I think that as a result, we kind of got the policy wrong, that when people lost their jobs, then we provided an income stream, and that just did not do it. And, yeah.
Well, I think the other part of it is that there's also a loss of hope when you lose a job, and when you don't have income. It's not just that you don't have an income stream, but you also there's no opportunity to replace what you've lost. And so that's where I think that the desperation really starts to kick in. And we've seen that also in communities abroad as well, in the developing world. When there's no hope, then it's very hard to lift up a community. But if you can actually inject a measure of hope, and that could be through various types of nudges, targeted subsidies, targeted programs, then you really can begin to turn around a community. And hope is actually hard to quantify in terms of how it can really lift up a community. But there has been some really good research that shows that, sometimes when you give a family, like for instance, the greatest, real fun programs are, when you give a family a goat, it's, in a place like India, you give them a goat, and then you measure what the income stream should be based on how much that goat would bring back. And you find that in fact, a few years later, they've far exceeded that, because that goat not only gave them money from the milk that was sold, but it also gave them hope that, oh, well, now maybe I can plant some vegetables. I can sell those vegetables. Oh, let's plant an apple tree as well. Oh, let's get some chickens. It's sort of a virtuous cycle. Whereas a lot of these communities right now are sort of mired in a vicious cycle: no jobs, and then no hope, and then self-medication, leading to, unemployable, workers.
Right.
So
in this case, when we speak of hope, are we, is it hope for chickens, and another goat, or is it hope for something else? I'm thinking of a book by an anthropologist called, I think it's called The Whole Package, by a guy named Nick Townsend. And his point was that a wage wasn't just a wage. So you didn't hope for the wage, but the wage came with these other things you're speaking of, a sense of being a proud dad, being able home owner, car, a supportive wife in the old days, and that's what one hopes for,
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's the whole package, as you say, as the book says.
But yeah, and I think it does suggest, this notion of rising economically. And so Rod Chetty at Harvard has done work on cohorts, and the cohort, I think, born in 1944, that 90% of them at age 30 were earning more than their parents had earned at age 30. For the cohort born in 1984, only half were earning as much as their parent of the same sex had earned at age 30. And So half were earning less. And, that's, I think, what was really striking about my old classmates, that this was an area that really had done very well. So there was this expectation that the kids were going to continue to move upward. And then they just ran into a brick wall. And perhaps that crash was particularly painful because expectations had been so great.
Right. And expectations had, so it's a loss story and a identity loss story. We could partly say, leading to these devastating, it is a crisis, but it's these sort of soft things that are part of that. I think that's what how I read your book. You want to give us the whole story of what a loss really feels like and how deep it goes. But you say another thing that's a real, I think, eye-opener for the reader, that the average household today is poorer than it was in 2020. I mean, wow, tell us about that.
Yeah, I mean, so there's been this great divergence in incomes and wealth, basically by status. So if I remember right, the average weekly earnings were lower, adjusted for inflation, in 2018 than they had been in 1974, maybe. And for the higher end, it was a huge multiple. For the lower end, they were actually earning less. And that for wealth, I believe, well, for wealth, there was basically, for the bottom half of the distribution, essentially people had less wealth than they'd had in 2000, partly because so many families had lost homes in
no way. Yeah.
which was much of their equity.
Right.
And so I don't think people quite appreciate how much downward mobility there's been for the bottom half of the distribution. That if you were a high school graduate or had less than high school education, then you were one of the families we write about, the Knapps. The dad had almost no education, but he had a good union job laying pipe, and he'd been able to earn good living. They bought their own home. For the kids, that was just impossible. And all 5 kids are now gone.
And I think it's really important to understand that, when we talk about just the difference in economic strata and how there has been lack of mobility, it doesn't have to be that way. There are policies that we can, targeted policies that we can adopt that would change that. But now when people talk about this whole idea of, it's your own responsibility, this,
right.
Narrative of personal responsibility, which, perhaps you wanted to touch on as well later. But I just wanted to add that the problem is that works when there's a very mobile society, when you can actually rise up through the bottom 10 to the next 20 to the next 30 and 40. That's not happening in the US. The mobility that we used to have as a society to be able to move from the bottom 10% to the top 10%, it is not there, and we are less mobile as a society than the United Kingdom, which has been known for centuries as a very stratified society.
Yeah. What I think what I hear you saying is that in a way, before we get to the solutions and the policies that would get us out of this mess, which your book is very rich with, there's a problem of seeing the problem. And I think we live in a world in America where we look at gross domestic product, and that is a generalized term. And our president will point to that, well, if stocks are up, then America is fine and great again. But what you're saying is that obscures, that makes it hard for us to see what you're pointing to is that good half of the population is actually going down. My own read on this, I'd love your take, is that from about the early 1970s, we had kind of a globalization. We had offshoring. We had also automation, but companies became no longer in a handshake with the government. They could just leave. And what it left us with is a sector that was the winners of globalization and the losers of globalization. And that what we have in your stories are people who are scrambling in that lower sector. And in my own project, Understand the Growth of the Right in America, it's that same sector, only I would call it kind of the elite of the left behind. The people I looked at were not abjectly poor, but they were one up from that. They were the kids of the blue collar. They were bricklayers and pipe fitters too, and still had those jobs, but their kids weren't getting those jobs, and they were holding on. It was a loss story, not just an absolute deprivation story. And so globalization, what we have to do to get under the kind of statistics that are usually given to us, so which are generalized, is to look at that split. But when that split is often looked at, it feels like such an abstract thing. Oh, yes, Amazon gazillionaires, and we don't have that. But if you think of, if you put faces on the people on each slope, which I think your book, Tightrope, really masterfully does, we get to see that that split is huge, and that we're mainly looking, and television is giving us gilded lifestyle styles of people on the top sector, and that's not a loss or that is holding on to the social mobility. Things are getting better. People, what you're saying is this is the hidden part of it. It's not getting better in your sector.
It's a little like, when Jeff Bezos walks into a bar and everybody on average becomes a billionaire. It's great, not terribly useful for everybody else. And that's kind of what we've seen. I completely agree with you that the 1970s is when things began to change. And I think that globalization and technology were a part of it. But I think that it was really more about our choices and narratives as a country. And, Germany and Canada were obviously also affected by globalization and by technology. And yet you don't have 70,000 people in those countries dying of overdoses each year. You don't have life expectancy falling in those countries. And you don't have, in the US, we have 3 counties where we have a shorter life expectancy than in Bangladesh or Cambodia. And I think that fundamentally it's certainly shaped by globalization, shaped by corporations that were increasingly about shareholders and not stakeholders. But I think at the end of the day, an awful lot of it was about this narrative that in the US that took hold, that government can't do anything, that regulation is a huge mistake, and that it's all about bad choices and personal responsibility. And I think those are at the root of our failure to address these problems.
So let me give you an example that I think is really interesting. So after the great financial crisis, the Great Recession in 2008, auto workers were laid off. They were laid off in Detroit in the US, and they were also laid off often by the same company in Windsor, Ontario, Canada. So we had an opportunity to compare how the two countries handled it. So in the US, of course, because it was a great recession, it was terrible, they gave extra, unemployment insurance. But these families, they lost their health care because when, a worker loses his job, he loses his health care. So on top of losing a job, you have this double whammy, and the poor family is just really, really devastated. Over in Canada, what happened was, yes, they lost their job. Well, they didn't lose their health care because, of course, nationalized, healthcare in Canada allowed these people to maintain and have some health care. At the same time, the government, they said, okay, they stepped in and said, where else in this local area do we see an opportunity to retrain these people and give them jobs? It could be a different industry, because unlikely we're going to see auto workers rehired anytime soon. They found that healthcare had a real need. So they facilitated training programs for these workers to learn something about healthcare so they can get jobs in the local healthcare, among the local healthcare employers. So the result was these people were re-ushered back into the workday world. They always had their health care. They didn't self-medicate. Years later, they've got a thriving job. Their families are doing fine. Whereas we saw what happened in Detroit. It had to crawl back over many, many years. And that's the difference in a policy response and how, we can, have change. We don't have to, it's not inevitable that we have to suffer this way.
Yeah. So in a way, would you say that there are two things going on? One is the narrative, and the other is helpful or unhelpful policies, right? And that these two things are connected, that when you have a narrative that's in denial of the bottom, oh, everything's fine, you can all rise up. You have corresponding declining faith in government, and none of the policies such as you're drawing attention to. In a way, are you saying that a lot of people, these diseases of despair, are dying of a narrative?
Yeah, I mean, I really do think that's fair, that the narrative, if I try to understand why it is that the US doesn't have, say child allowances are just a kind of a no-brainer policy that would reduce child poverty in half. Canada has them, Britain has them, most of Europe has them, the US does not have them. So why don't we have them? It's not that we lack the means, it's not that we lack the toolbox. We see this in other countries, the same with early child, national pre-K. And so why don't we do these things? I do think that it's fundamentally the narrative. And I think that that narrative in turn is killing people. It's the same narrative that led us not to regulate pharma companies as they were peddling drugs, whereas Canada regulated them, Europe regulated them, and the US believed that laissez-faire. And so we have 70,000 people dying a year now of overdoses. So I think, I hadn't thought of it that way until you put it that way, Arlie, but I think that's right, that people are dying from a narrative.
But at the same time, they may have conviction in this narrative, but it's almost duplicitous, because we met so many people, and I'm not trying to fault them, but on the one hand, they believe in this, personal narrative of personal responsibility. On the other hand, they're really happy when expanded Medicaid allows them to go to the hospital when they're sick and they don't have to pay. Why should they have to pay for that? Because, the government should pay. So it's also a matter of education. It's a matter of educating people so that they, realize that there are other, other ways to approach, other than this narrative, other ways to approach life.
Now I'm going to ask a question that may be on everybody's mind, but just speculatively, do you feel like Donald Trump has come in and provided a narrative that wasn't provided by the Democratic Party, and that's part of the reason for his rise?
Yeah, I absolutely think that.
Yeah.
Arlie, I thought your book was brilliant in the narrative that it provided, and it was one that people in Louisiana could understand and agree with, and it was one that California liberals could agree with. And that was a remarkable kind of, achievement. I think that President Trump provided a narrative that appealed to people in Yamhill, and Yamhill voted for Donald Trump in 2016 and will probably do so again in 2020. And it was about immigrants stealing jobs. And it was about elites betraying you and sending jobs abroad. And China, well, now it's about China unleashing this virus out to destroy America, and QAnon. And I remember FDR writing about that when people are struggling and jobless and afraid, that they're more likely to grasp these kinds of narratives and threads. And I see that in Yamhill today with these rumors going around about Antifa. And the other day we were back in Yamhill and we were visiting a chunk of forest on a road, and on a neighbor's parcel with their permission, and somebody saw us and put a log behind our car and called the sheriff because they thought we must be Antifa arsonists setting fires. And it's just, you just see the social fabric unraveling because President Trump is coming up with this narrative about, it's kind of appealing if you're trying to, in the little ice age in what century was it? The 15th century. So witchcraft trials increased dramatically because people needed an explanation for their harvests failing. And in 2020, people need a narrative about why there are forest fires or why their jobs have disappeared.
That's right. What's interesting too, he talks about the wall. Oh, the wall keeping hordes of immigrants coming. And if we must build that wall, they're the cause of your problem, keep them out. While he is actually building a wall between the blue collar class and the white collar class by reducing the Pell Grants and
right.
Making it harder to get a BA, which we know opens up the possibility to the newer jobs that are coming down the pike and the better paid jobs. So
absolutely.
The problem is that I think that
wall is kind of keeping.
Yeah.
I mean, he's doing it in the same way that Hitler did it, so it's not exactly a great achievement on his part. I mean, he is sort of a great manipulator, and it's sad to see that so many people are vulnerable to this manipulation.
But he does seem to acknowledge the pain in a way that
yes.
I feel had not been done before in 2016. That don't want to go totally off on this, but I felt like Hillary was more everything's fine, we just keep it going, and his narrative was no, it's not fine. It needs to get great again, and what he meant was blue collar and white again lift up. But he was in a way acknowledging things and trying to, in other words, trying to get the trade deficit with China fixed, trying to undo all these treaties. You can see him in his primitive and bare-pawed way, why a blue collar person would say, well, at least he sees that I'm stuck. And,
yeah.
I don't know whether that was by chance, because I think that he was creating demons that weren't there. And so he just happened to find scapegoats that people could believe in. And that's what really gave them something to cling on to.
But right. One of the people that
look at the effect of Trump policies on blue collar in the last 3.5 years.
Right.
Excuse me for answering the question myself a little bit, but one by one, is your water cleaner? No. EPA got my third. Are you earning more money basically for blue collar? No. And your household income is no better than it was. Your chances of getting an education aren't as good.
And the trade deficit with China is larger.
The deficit Oh, yeah.
I mean, I do have to say that because the economy was continuing to expand until this year and unemployment continuing to fall, that there was a drop in kind of the hardest to employ people, low skilled workers, and they did enjoy real income gains in 2017, 2018, 2019. That wasn't because of anything he particularly did. It was because the economy just continued to expand at roughly the same rate it had.
It had before.
Well,
Yeah.
the tax cuts did actually give another boost to the economy. So I think that tax cuts in 2018 really did energize the economy.
But to your point about why people would believe this, one of the people we wrote about was my old 7th grade crush, Mary Mayer. And Mary is very smart and talented, but she ended up homeless for 7 years. She was wrestling with alcohol and drugs. And I think 4 members of her family had committed suicide at one point. She put a gun to her head. And so I think from her perspective, Democratic politicians weren't speaking to her about the pain that she experienced and the pain all around her. And it just seemed a different world. And I asked her, did you ever think that politics could be a solution to the kind of problems that you have and your community has? And she said, she never had until 2016 when she heard Donald Trump. And she felt, that he spoke to her and he talked about these, immigrants taking your jobs. And she thought, okay, here's somebody who's finally speaking to me and not talking down to me. And so she voted for the first time in her life in 2016 for Donald Trump.
Wow.
And then I, completely agree with you that then he hijacked that movement, and then he used that to make it harder to access benefits, harder to access food stamps, harder to access Medicaid, put in work requirements, created a tax cut that largely benefited the wealthiest. But that wasn't so obvious to Mary. And a lot of the people in this community, I suspect in the communities you wrote about, they live in an ecosystem, kind of a Facebook ecosystem, in which their news source is not the New York Times and is more like QAnon. And it becomes kind of difficult to break through that ecosystem.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask you what you see as, as solutions. I guess one would involve trying to break through that ecosystem and get some bridging going. But you also point to policies. If we could only get the narrative to point to the policies, what policies would you like to see?
Well, I think it's important also, not just the policy, but also, on the ground, implementation of programs that actually help people break their perception of the world. So Provoking Hope is a really good example. You could call it a drug treatment rehabilitation program, but it's more than that. It just helps people change their worldview. And we saw that with someone named Drew Goff, who was the son of someone who worked on the family farm for many, many years, who was a very, very intelligent man, but was just born in the wrong area. And so Drew actually started using drugs when he was 12 years old. And he had just, after that, he really didn't finish school. He never held a job. And by now he's like in his 30s. And we sort of ran into him at this program, Provoking Hope, which he had tried several times and never gotten through. But this time he had been in this program for like a year and a half. And his counselors were really excited that he was going to make it to the end. They really, really were delighted with him. And he was changing his worldview. I mean, he was seeing that there's an end in sight, and that he could climb that hill or get through that tunnel to that light. And it was interesting because one thing that did help him was he had custody of a newborn child named Ashton, who was basically 6 months. The wife, his wife, ex-wife, was in prison. So he was the one left holding the baby. And he realized that he's got this fragile baby in his hand and he is going to take care of this baby no matter what. He got a lot of help. He had parenting lessons from Provoking Hope, because not only do they help you with drug treatment, they give you counseling, therapy, group therapy, parenting skills, job skills, everything. And that gave him a lot more hope. And he realized how wasteful his whole, and unproductive his worldview had been. And so at one point in time, he told us he was a hotel clerk, and it was 4 months. And he said, "This is the longest I've ever held a job." And we were really excited. And then in February of this year, we saw him. We were in Oregon and we saw him again. And we were hoping that he was still working at that hotel. And so we asked him, "Are you still at the hotel?" And he goes, "No." And we were just crestfallen. We thought, oh no, he fell off again. Then he said, "I'm working for a moving company and I have 10 people working for me." So he had become a manager, and he was just doing so well. And his kid was doing well. I mean, it was just like, yes, there is hope. And I think that that's changed his worldview. So
Yes.
On the ground programs that are made available because of policy decisions. So Provoking Hope gets subsidies, gets contracts with the county health department. So, obviously it's the result of expanded Medicaid. So that has direct impact on people's lives. And so
Wonderful.
it's
So in a way, what you're doing is putting culture and narrative together with policy.
yes.
Yeah.
Pointing to the power of culture to open up economic life. Wonderful.
I wonder if, sorry to butt into this fantastic conversation, but I thought maybe we could take a couple questions from the audience. There's a good one here, and I also encourage anybody else who is watching to use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen to write a question, and I will have a look and I will repeat it for the participants here. Julie Moore Felix is saying, "I am curious about your perspective on what has motivated Americans who identify as evangelical or are among the religious right to give such allegiance to President Trump, despite the obvious contradictions he presents to Christian values, like, paying off porn stars and things like that." For example.
Right.
I've had some thoughts about that.
Go ahead.
And I don't know if the question was addressed to me, but me offer this. I think that although it seems inexplicable because so many values, the value on empathy, on help for others, on sexual fidelity and so on, are all thrown away, and he doesn't look Christian. And you ask him what's his favorite book in the Bible, he says, "Oh, I like them all." So not a religious guy, but I think he had a very brilliant read on an underlying underlying metaphor, underlying kind of way of thinking. And I think we need to explore how these work. And the underlying way of thinking for an evangelical is that Christ has saved me, that he suffers for me. And I think that Donald Trump has, in a way, insinuated himself into that. And he is saying, "I am doing for you. You love me. I am saving you from all that we've been talking about, that despair." And then he's saying, "Oh, and look at all the enemies I face. Look at the deep state. Look at the treasonous mainstream media, look at, Democratic Party and so on. I am surrounded by enemies, and that he gives that a paranoid character. And so help me defend me against those enemies. And I suffer for you. I am going down. I even thought that COVID actually kind of fit into this. I am, and he's being resurrected. And so I think there is he's a little bit imagining himself as Jesus Christ. And I think people imagine him as that. And that's what I think the appeal is. Not on the surface, but underlyingly.
I should say, just to offer a ray of hope, my column that will go online tomorrow morning is based on conversations with some evangelicals who are pushing back at Trump and trying to recruit other white evangelicals to reject Trump, and maybe more importantly, to redefine what it means to be pro-life, because the whole notion of resisting abortion has been so central to the evangelical movement that I think it has given a pass to basically anything else. And Billy Graham's granddaughter told me that, she wished the Democratic Party would care more about, as she puts it, life in the womb, but she wishes the Republican Party would care more about life outside the womb. And there, you do begin to sense that within the evangelical community, there is some broadening of what pro-life, as they put it, means, and also recognizing that if you want to reduce the number of abortions, then that may not so much be about making abortions illegal, but about providing comprehensive sex education, about providing access to contraception, about providing support for people. And so there just may be, particularly among young people and among women, some rethinking of that support that evangelicals have provided for Trump.
But I also think that in some ways it also has to do with traditional alignments, traditional allegiances. And so, conservative means you don't embrace change as readily. And so I do think that sometimes the religious community, they feel they owe an allegiance to a certain party. They've been aligned with the Republican Party for quite a while, and it's really hard to break out. I mean, I think that you feel that you know a party very well, and they're your friends, and just to break away would be kind of, it would be treason. I mean, and so I think that divorce is just also very hard.
There's a question here about pre-K education. Speaking of education, is there any hope for having that for everybody? It would be so worthwhile for marginalized populations.
So we actually think that early childhood education is one of the most important things to actually put the next generation on the best footing possible for this country. It's critical. And it also is a potential issue that both sides can maybe come to terms on, in the sense that if you look at some of the states that have really good early childhood education programs, they tend to be red states. They really have done a very good job in certain states. Oklahoma, for instance, very strong early childhood education program. And if we can actually depoliticize the topic so that it doesn't become, this is the idea of the right or the idea of the left, then we might be able to come to terms with it. Just say, this is a practical, program that we need, that everybody needs. And it's just, if we want to get, the economy going again, we need to give parents a way to, give their kids childcare.
Right. I would start, we know from a lot of studies, have very long lasting effects. So these are policies you can look at it. Both sides, as you were saying, Sheryl, would agree, hey, these outcomes look terrific.
And this is a year in which Joe Biden has promised that as part of his platform that he would introduce a national high quality pre-K. I would note that the polling suggests that it's easier to sell. So I think the experts think that the main reason to do this is the benefits to the child, and as Arlie says, that these extend throughout life. But it seems to be easier to sell to the public as a childcare
Right.
program, to make it easier for parents who vote, of course, to work. And it's basically the same program. It's just whether it's billed as early childhood or as childcare. But it seems a little easier to sell in the latter.
Yeah, makes sense. Barbara Solomon asks what the authors suggest as a policy to narrow the income gap, to shrink the 1% and raise up the lower classes. That's a big order right there.
Well, I would, so, I mean, raising the minimum wage to some degree is critical, but one of the things that really struck us was we reported on McDonald's workers in Denmark who, McDonald's pays burger flippers in Denmark $22 an hour, plus a defined benefit pension plan, plus a year maternity leave, et cetera, et cetera. And how does it manage to make a business model work, paying that? And it seems to be that essentially, if you were people who work at McDonald's world over who are not students are at maybe the 20th percentile of the labor force. And in the US, somebody who is at the 20th percentile of the labor force is a high school dropout, is not particularly literate, not particularly numerate, may well have a dependency issue, may well have their driver's license suspended because they're behind on child support, and is not a enormously reliable employee in many cases. Whereas in Denmark, that 20th percentile worker, because Denmark greatly invests in the human capital of its citizens from early childhood on, that 20th percentile worker is a high school graduate, is literate, is numerate, and generates more than $22 of revenue for McDonald's there. And so the lesson to that for us was that trying to address inequality is partly about some quick fixes involving raising the minimum wage, but maybe more importantly, it's really about a longer effort to invest in our citizens and especially in children. And that, because we've underinvested in children over the last 50 years, is going to take time.
Sheryl or Arlie, do you want to add anything to that?
Amen.
I think we have, I'm just going to, throw my own question out there to kind of close out the hour. You didn't write these books to, I don't think, you didn't write these books to change people's minds, but nonetheless, I think you have, in the sense that I read a great quote recently by Montesquieu, the French philosopher. He said, "The best arguments in the world won't change a person's mind. The only thing that can change a person's mind is a good story."
Mm.
And I thought, well, that's kind of what your books are about. Understanding and bridging the gap between, the people you hang out with and the ones that are marching and raising flags pro-Trump. And I just think it's an amazing undertaking, and wonder, anyway, what are your thoughts on that, about changing people's minds and writing nonfiction as journalists, playing it straight down the middle, or,
Well, we
I think both of our books share the quality of inviting the reader to get to know people that we know now, that we've come to know, or that we always knew. And just in enlarging the number of people in their living room. And when they hear stories from the people who are now, through these books, in their living room, they do change, I think, because they will come to like these people in certain ways and listen to those stories, and that change happens that way, as opposed to saying, "Oh, you're wrong."
right. Yeah, that's kind of what I was going for.
But I also think the change is on both sides, because I think that a lot of the Democrats, they are not as sensitive, and Arlie, you mentioned this earlier too, to some of the pain that is going on in these basically rural white communities that are very pro-Trump. And I think that they have, people need to more understand what kind of pain that they're going through. And, hopefully there will be a little bit change, as education levels rise, because the key is education, I think. We saw so much that it was lack of education that held a lot of these people back. They didn't have high school education, or, they never went to college. Most of these people that we write about, didn't go to college. And I think if we can, lift those education levels, we have a fighting chance to lift people out of poverty too, because education really is the best escalator out of poverty.
So if I could add one more thing, I think what your book also says, and mine points to too, there are a lot of common experiences between Blacks and whites. There are, and that's, you educate educated people about how much we have in common, and I think that's a kind of observation we need to enrich going forward. But if you look at drug addiction, you look at unemployment, you look at families falling apart, that is the same sad story, but the same hopeful story too, that there's a lot of human potential underneath it.
One of the things we really admired from and learned about Strangers, about your book, was the way you presented these very complex people who I kind of started out maybe wanting to dislike, and then, develop some affection for, just as you were clearly developing an affection for them, even as you wanted to pull your hair out. And I kind of felt the same about a lot of my my old friends, and I think they felt sort of the same about me. But we really did, I think, want people, we really did want to change minds in some ways when we wrote it. And I think one of the impetuses for us was seeing the grandkids of some of the kids that I'd gone to school with. One of my closest buddies, Clayton Green, has died, but he's got 5 grandkids, all taken away by the state. And I wonder, what's going to happen to them? Another dear friend of mine has 2 grandkids who've been abused and are now being homeschooled by a mom who only went to a few months of school herself. And I don't want what happened to the number 6 bus of my generation to happen again to these kids. And I think that maybe the way of changing that is to try to tackle some of these narratives about personal responsibility, about lifting oneself up by the bootstraps, about bad choices that I think are so inimical to good policy formation and just a good old basic empathy.
I think that's a great place to end it. And I apologize for any questions that didn't get answered. We could go on for another half hour, but I promised the participants we would limit it to 1 fantastic hour. So thank you so much, Arlie, Nicholas, Sheryl.
Thank you, Arlie, and thank you.
It was an amazing hour. And I just can't think of 3 better authors to be in conversation than you 3. So if participants, if you get the Lit Quake survey, please answer it, and please tune in. We got many more events coming up this week that you will enjoy. Thanks all for coming.
See you.
Take care.
Have a
Thank
good
you
night.
so much.
Vote.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.